Welcome, everybody. Today, we're going to go over the Child Care Development Fund, CCDF, Plan Section 4, Direct Services for tribal lead agencies with small locations. Tribal lead agencies with small locations have flexibility in how CCDF services are provided. Child care services should be based on what best fits your tribal community's needs. On the next slide, we'll introduce ourselves. My name is Melissa Madrid, and I am the Deputy Project Director for the Tribal Child Care Capacity Building Center, and I am joined by my colleague, Ashley.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ashley Largo. I am the Tribal Technical Assistant Manager for the Tribal Child Care Capacity Building Center.
Thank you, Ashley. On the next slide, we'll talk about objectives. The objectives for this session are for you to understand the flexibilities for implementing direct childcare services for tribal lead agencies with small locations, including offering direct childcare services, direct childcare funding methods, eligibility criteria, payment rates, and understand what sufficient responses are for Section 4. Next slide. So you might be wondering what we mean when we refer to direct services. Direct childcare services are the act of providing childcare to a CCDF eligible child by an CCDF eligible childcare provider for the purpose of CCDF. As an example of this would be a caregiver caring for an infant or a preschool teacher providing care for a group of 3 or 4-year-olds. Direct services can also be referred to as the act of paying for childcare services to a childcare provider in the form of a subsidy payment. Next, we will review the ways a CCDF program can fund childcare services. Next slide. Tribal lead agencies with small allocations do not have to offer direct services to children, but CCDF funds must be used in alignment with the goals and purposes of CCDF 98.1. If the tribal lead agency chooses to offer direct childcare services, it is exempt from the regulations related to child eligibility, which is on 98.20 and 98.21, equal access 98.45, and consumer education 98.30 through 34. In this section, if a tribal lead agency checks yes, this indicates it will offer direct childcare services and must complete the remaining section questions in Section 4. If no is checked, the tribal lead agency is indicating it will not offer direct services and will spend its CCDF funds for allowable CCDF purposes. For example, if the tribally operated center is funded by tribal or other funds, then quality funds could be used to improve the quality of childcare services provided by the program. While tribal lead agencies with small locations do not have to offer direct childcare services, most tribal lead agencies with small allocation do choose to offer them. Again, if no is checked, skip 4.2.1 through 4.4.1, and the application is complete. On the next slide, we'll be talking about funding methods for direct childcare services. Tribes have options for how they can pay for direct childcare services, and we refer to those options as funding methods. A tribal lead agency can choose from the following ways to pay for childcare. A certificate or voucher is issued by the tribal lead agencies for parents to use to pay for childcare to an eligible childcare provider. Tribal lead agencies may pay the certificate directly to an eligible provider on behalf of the parents. Families may obtain a certificate that they can use to purchase childcare of their choice. Grants or contracts. Tribal lead agencies may provide services through grants and contracts with eligible providers to directly serve CCDF eligible families. This means the agency pays a provider for a childcare slot, and that slot is held until it's filled by a child enrolled in the CCDF program. Grants and contracts can be used to build the supply of available childcare slots and help provide stable funding for providers. Grants and contracts for childcare slots normally include a written agreement or contract between the tribe and the eligible provider, outlining the scope of services and responsibilities. Tribal lead agencies that use CCDF funds for contracts or grants may have slots that are going to go unfilled at times, and that's completely okay. This is an allowable expenditure, even if there are periods of time that the contracted slot is vacant. CCDF-funded tribally operated centers, or often referred to as TOCs, can choose to use their CCDF funds to cover all of the operational costs of their own childcare center. This is considered a CCDF-funded operated center. Regardless of the way that you choose to pay for direct services, tribal lead agencies are responsible for ensuring that all providers of direct childcare, even those tribally operated centers, meet the provider eligibility requirements, follow applicable health and safety standards, and do adhere to the tribal lead agency's policies and procedures. In this section, you will check the box that applies to the funding methods the tribal lead agency uses to provide direct childcare services. In this part, at least one box must be checked. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ashley to take a deeper and closer look.
So first, let's look at child care certificates and vouchers. On the screen, you'll see a flow chart that shows a visual of the process of how the CCDF funding flows from the tribal lead agency, your CCDF program, to the eligible family or the eligible child care provider. First, the tribal lead agency creates and shares applications for CCDF services throughout the service area. Families with eligible children apply for services by completing and submitting the application to the CCDF program. The CCDF program then determines whether the family is eligible for CCDF services. If they are eligible, then a certificate is generated and issued to the family. The parent would then take the certificate to the eligible child care provider that they have chosen to provide direct services for their child. Next slide. Now let's take a look at grants and contracts. Tribal lead agencies can use grants and contracts to fund childcare slots with eligible providers to directly serve CCDF eligible families. The tribal lead agency enters into a contract or grant with an eligible childcare provider who agrees to hold slots open for eligible children for payment. Once a family comes to the tribal lead agency and applies for services and is deemed eligible, the family could choose to take one of the available slots from the eligible contracted provider to receive childcare services. For example, grants or contracts for direct services are strategies that tribal lead agencies can use to support equal access, ensuring that families have a choice of a range of providers, increase the supply of quality childcare for underserved or vulnerable populations, and stabilize childcare providers. This type of approach could help guarantee that families have access to available slots exactly when they need them, such as during critical times of homelessness or while activity searching for housing and employment opportunities. By providing this support, families are better positioned to regain stability and navigate challenges circumstances while their child is being cared for in a safe environment. Remember, tribal lead agencies can use CCDF funds for contracts or grants, may have childcare slots that are unfilled at times. Next slide. Finally, let's take a look at the process for tribally operated centers, which we know as TOCs. Tribally agencies can choose to use their CCDF funds for operational costs for their own childcare facilities, referred to as a tribally operated center. The benefit of providing childcare services through a tribally operated childcare center includes having an early learning facility on or near tribal lands and the ability to incorporate the tribe's language and culture into the child's curriculum. CCDF program is budgeted to directly support and fund the center and includes all relevant expenses in the budget for the center. Please note that a tribally operated center that operates with CCDF funds would not be paying for slots at a tribally operated center. So for an example, a family comes to the tribally lead agency and applies for services. The tribal lead agency determines the family is eligible and the child is enrolled in the tribally operated center. But reminder that contracts and grants provided to eligible providers, which could include the TOC, are intended to make childcare slots available to families. The tribal lead agency has the flexibility to choose one or more of the funding methods to offer direct services. Now that we have covered funding methods, let's shift our attention to looking at eligibility criteria currently being applied by your tribal CCDF program for direct services. Next slide. And tribal lead agencies with small allocations who choose to provide direct child care services must, at a minimum, limit eligibility to Indian children as defined in your plan, questions 1.1.1, and reside in a defined service area at the time of eligibility determination or redetermination as defined in plan question 1.2.1. And I'm going to hand this over to Melissa.
Thank you so much, Ashley. On the next slide, we'll talk about definition of Indian child. Tribal lead agencies are required to provide a definition of Indian child in their child count declaration. A child must meet this definition to receive CCDF services. Tribal lead agencies have flexibility in defining Indian child and may include children from other federally recognized tribes. There is broad flexibility regarding how tribal lead agencies choose to define Indian child. Tribal lead agencies can choose to define Indian child as a child who is an enrolled member of the federally recognized tribe. They can also choose to define Indian child more broadly as any child who has verifiable American Indian or Alaska Native ancestry as determined by either tribal enrollment, a certificate of Indian blood, or a birth certificate documenting lineal descent. The definition of Indian child can include children who are tribal members whose membership is pending, who are eligible for membership, and who are children of descendants of members. This could also include children who do not have tribal ancestry, but may be adopted, foster children, and stepchildren. Tribal lead agencies can include children from other tribes in their definition of Indian child if the tribes are federally recognized. We also want to share that the tribe's definition of Indian child can vary from its specific tribal citizenship or enrollment criteria. At a federally recognized Indian tribe means an Indian or Alaska Native tribe, band, nation, pueblo, village, or community which appears on the list of recognized tribes published in the Federal Registry by the Secretary of the Interior, 25 USC 5131. On the next slide, we'll talk about definition of service area. A tribal lead agency service area must be on or near the reservation and therefore must be within a reasonable close geographic proximity to the delineated borders of a tribe's reservation. Tribes that do not have reservations must establish service areas within reasonable close proximity to the area where the tribe's population resides. ACF will not approve an entire state as a tribe service area. For example, if a service area is based on a close proximity is too large to adequately meet the needs of children who are eligible for CCDF, a tribal lead agency may choose to reduce its service area size and only focus on the area where their CCDF eligible families reside and work. Here's another example. If a service area is based on close proximity and it does not include an area with a large population of CCDF eligible families, the tribal lead agency may choose to readjust its service area. On the next slide, we'll talk about considerations for eligibility criteria. Tribes of all allocations have the option to use income as an eligibility criteria or as a method to prioritize services. For example, the tribal lead agency could collect family income and use it to prioritize children for slots in the tribally operated center. Tribal lead agencies with small allocations also do not need to require that a parent is engaged in eligible activity, as we like to call it sometimes. This means they do not have to be employed or in job training or enrolled in an educational program. You can just require that this if you'd like to. We know some tribes choose to instead prioritize services for family engaged in these or other activities but will continue to serve any Native child in their service area as long as their funding allows. Another exemption to this allocation size is that childcare services do not need to be limited to children under the age of 13. You have the flexibility to only offer services to a certain age range or group if you choose as well. It should be noted that regardless of this flexibilities, thus funds still need to be used for childcare. On the next slide, we will talk about considerations to prioritize childcare services. On the screen, you will see eligible criteria samples. Tribal lead agencies with small allocations could consider some of the eligibility criteria that medium and large allocations are subject to. Keep in mind, criteria on this list could be used for prioritization without making them eligible criteria for eligibility. And remember, choose eligibility based on a reason for care is completely optional for tribes with small locations. And you also have the flexibility to define working, attending job training, attending an educational program, and a protective services if you choose to do so. I'm going to now turn it over to Ashley.
Thanks, Melissa. In question 1.8.1, 1.8.2, and question 1.8.3, you identified the categories of care you are offering. You will need to set payment rates for each of those categories of care. The goal of direct services in CCDF is to ensure that families have equal access to stable childcare financial assistance through subsidy payments to provide eligible CCDF children with safe and healthy childcare settings that support children's overall health and development. As a reminder, the categories of care include center-based childcare, including the tribally operated center, and that is group care provided in a facility outside of the child's or provider's home. Looking at family child care or care provided in a private residence other than the child's residence. And last, in-home child care, which is care provided in a child's own home. So let's move to the next slide to talk a little bit about relative care. A CCDF-approved relative provider must be an individual over the age of 18 who is one of the following: a grandparent, great-grandparent, aunt, uncles, or siblings living in a separate residence. It is important to note that while other family members may still provide childcare, they do not qualify as a relative provider for CCDF exemption purposes. Relative care can exist within either a family or in an in-home child care. And there are benefits to choosing relative care as well. Next slide. In this section, the tribal lead agency will describe the payment rate process, including how the payment rates are determined and the process for issuing payments to providers. It could also include a description of the base payment rates, different payment rates for different categories of care, and parent co-payments. If the tribal lead agency only operates a tribally operated center funded by the CCDF, in CARS, you will skip this question. Tribal lead agencies with small allocations have broad flexibility in setting payment rates. And payment rates could include information like those required for tribal lead agencies with medium and large allocations. So for more information, you can review section 6.2.2 in the submission guide. I'm going to hand this over to Melissa to finish us out.
Thank you so much, Ashley. As we wrap up this session, we want to provide some things for you to think about. What additional information do you need in order to fill out section 4 of the plan concerning eligibility criteria for children, payment rates for childcare providers, funding methods for direct childcare services, and thinking about what partners might you need to connect with about this section, including what questions or topics would be helpful to discuss with OCC. On the next slide, we'd like to share how to connect with us. If you are not already, please do subscribe to our OCC announcement to receive all of the latest information. Also, feel free to email us at occtribal@acf.hhs.gov if you'd like to connect directly. We appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for joining us.